In the middle of Huntington, West Virginia, there is a river. And next to this river, there is a steel mill. And next to the steel mill, there is a school. And in the middle of this school, there is a fountain. And each year, at the exact same day, the exact same hour, the water to this fountain is turned off. And in this moment, once every year, throughout the town, throughout the school, time stands still. Most of you listening to this only need to hear the first line to know exactly where this quote is from. For those that don't, this quote is the beginning of the movie We Are Marshall, which details the tragic plane crash on November 14th, 1970, that changed Marshall University football forever. This is a story not only of the 75 lives lost that day, but of a school and community that rose from the ashes afterwards. This is the story of the crash of Southern Airways Flight 932. Welcome to Creepalachia. I appreciate you being here for this. I'm so grateful to be able to read this story, and shout out to Miranda Weeks. I know we got the facts right on this one. She spent countless hours putting this together for everyone, and go Herd, baby. I know we bicker at each other with me being a Ears fan, but it's all love. Marshall Thundering Herd has a huge spot in my life. I used to go to games when I was a kid, and just very appreciative of your time and you being here to hear this story with me. So without further ado, let's get started. So we will begin with just a little background on Marshall and how it got its roots. So Marshall University originally began as a small school in 1837 for the children of the farmers of Wyandotte, and was actually called Marshall Academy. Marshall got its name from Chief Justice John Marshall, who had died 2 years prior. Now, the school would officially become Marshall College in 1858 and operated until 1860, when the start of the Civil War caused it to close. It would reopen, though, as a teacher's school in 1867, just a few years after West Virginia became a state. And the Marshall Athletics Department began sometime in 1923 and was dubbed the Thundering Herd. Now, prior to that, the Marshall College teams went by the name Big Green because of the team colors being green and white. Marshall's beloved mascot, Marco the Bison, originated sometime in the 1930s, and at first consisted of a bison made out of paper mache. Now, Marco is now represented by someone in a full furry mascot costume and can be seen at most sporting events. Now, on March 2nd, 1961, Governor William Wallace Barron would sign the legislation that officially granted Marshall University status. So Marshall University had been experiencing some troubling times in the decade prior to the crash, particularly in the athletic department. The football program had already been experiencing problems in the 1960s, including having a poor record and seasons with no winning games. Fairfield Stadium, which was created in 1928 for the football team and seated 12,000 people, was officially condemned in 1962 for health and safety violations. Now, in 1968, an NCAA investigation found 144 recruiting violations, which led to Marshall's indefinite expulsion from the Mid-American Conference. The football and basketball coaches were also fired, and the NCAA investigation granted Marshall a 1-year probation as well. The Marshall athletic program had barely begun rebuilding when tragedy struck on that November day of the 14th in 1970. Now, November 14th, 1970 started out as a regular Saturday for the Marshall Thundering Herd football team. The team had traveled to Greenville, North Carolina the day prior to play at Ficklen Stadium against the East Carolina Pirates. It was the Herd's second season under coach Rick Tolley, and prior to the start of the game against the Pirates, they were down 2-6 so far in the season. Now, with 30 seconds left in the game against the Pirates, they were down 17-14, but still had hopes for a tie. Those hopes were dashed when quarterback Ted Shoebridge was called for intentional grounding, which left the Thundering Herd and its fans in the audience puzzled. Shoebridge had only been in the second half of the game and had given the herd 63 yards in less than a minute before the call came. Now, on a 3rd and 10 at the 25-yard line, Shoebridge faded to pass and was collared by a player for the Pirates named Jim Gudger at the 44-yard line. Shoebridge got off the pass, but was called for grounding the ball, which carried a 5-yard penalty from the spot of the call. Now, the pass was intended for halfback Art Harris, who fielded it on the bounce. This comes from a report by Herald Advisor sports writer Mike Brown, who had driven to the game with his wife. Now, while this was not their only away game that year, it was the only one where they were required to charter a plane in order to get there. However, there had been discussions about canceling this flight due to a plane crash involving the Wichita State football team that had occurred on October 2nd, 1970. The team was en route to Logan, Utah for a game at Utah State University when it crashed at approximately 3 p.m. on a mountain near Silver Plume, Colorado. Now, the plane, a Martin 404, carried 36 passengers and a crew of 4, with 29 of those people dying at the scene and 2 others dying later after receiving medical attention for their injuries. There were 9 survivors of this crash, which included 8 football players and the co-pilot of the plane. Now, unlike the Marshall crash, WSU's team had been split onto 2 different planes, and only 14 members of the football team died in the crash, as well as several team managers, the head coach, the athletic director, 2 state representatives, and several wives of the staff members. Now, WSU went on to compete in that football season by allowing freshmen to play, and their first game after the crash was on October 24th, 1970 in Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, despite discussions being had about canceling the flight due to that WSU crash, it was instead decided that they would charter a different type of plane. The plane in the WSU crash was a Martin 404, so the school decided to use a DC-9 for the Thundering Herd's flight instead. And at first, the proposal to charter the DC-9 was rejected because it would exceed the takeoff limitations of the aircraft. Now, the proposal was then approved after it was decided that there would be a reduction of the weight of passengers and baggage in order to fit the takeoff limitations. Now, it goes without saying that if they had stuck to the original plan and canceled the flight, there would be no story to tell. And so, after losing to East Carolina Pirates 17-14, the Thundering Herd and their staff, as well as team boosters, boarded the Southern Airways Flight 932 and began their journey back to Huntington, West Virginia. Now, the crew aboard the flight consisted of the captain and second officer and 2 flight attendants. The plane took off from Kinston Airport at approximately 6:28 p.m. and was expected to only last 52 minutes. The crew aboard Southern Airways Flight 932 successfully established radio contact with air traffic controllers at the Tri-State Airport at 7:23 p.m., in which the crew was given instructions to descend to 5,000 feet. Now, upon approaching the airport, air traffic controllers advised the crew that rain, fog, smoke, and a ragged ceiling were present at the airport, which would make the landing more difficult, but not impossible. And at 7:34 p.m., the plane's crew reported passing the Tri-State's Airport outer marker, which is a locator that emits a low-medium frequency to aid an aircraft's final approach. Now, the aircraft was given clearance for descent, but for unknown reasons did not arrest its descent and hold altitude at 1,240 feet as required by the assigned instrument approach procedure. Rather, the descent instead continued for about 300 feet, apparently without any of the crew members seeing the airport lights or the runway. Now, according to the transcript of the flight, communications in the final minutes, the pilots had debated whether their autopilot had captured the glide slope, which the Tri-State Airport was not equipped with. A glide slope is described as the proper path or descent for an aircraft preparing to land. which is typically indicated by a radio beam that would turn on a light in the pilot's cockpit. Now, the official report of the crash notes that Catlettsburg refinery near the airport could have affected a visual illusion produced by the difference in elevation of the refinery and the airport in the final 30 seconds before impact. Now, the airport was approximately 300 feet higher than the refinery, and there were hills located in between. The pilots aboard the craft could be heard counting down the feet till landing, going from 700 to 400 before the co-pilot calls out 100 and 2600. End quote. Now, the sounds of the impact could be heard over the radio immediately after. The flight data recorder that was found among the wreckage would reveal that the crew had initiated an effort to scrub the landing and to go around and try again, but as we all know, this attempt was unfortunately unsuccessful. And at approximately 7:36 p.m., the plane carrying members of the Marshall football team, their staff, and boosters crashed after clipping trees on a hill located about a mile from the runway threshold. After clipping the trees, the aircraft was flipped on its back and immediately burst into flames upon landing, which caused an area of the ground that measured 95 feet wide by 279 feet long to be charred. Now, by the time the plane came to a complete stop, it was only 4,219 feet short of the runway. The report that would eventually be published about this crash would describe this accident as unsurvivable, and all 75 passengers aboard this flight unfortunately perished. And while the remains of all of them were found, 6 of those remains were burned so badly that identification was impossible. Members of the National Transportation Safety Board quickly arrived to sift through the ashes with shovels to determine what exactly could have caused this terrible crash. Most of the fuselage had been melted or reduced to a powder-like substance, but several large pieces of the aircraft had been scattered throughout the burned area. They even ended up cutting up one of the 2 charred engines in hopes of finding a clue. According to newspapers, though, published in the days after the crash, investigators stated that the initial check of cockpit voice recordings showed no indication of either mechanical failure or pilot error. John H. Reed, the NTSB chairman, stated that the only thing that was obvious at that point was that the pilot had his craft flying too low, which caused the plane to clip the treetops on the ridge. Now, Representative Fletcher Thompson, a Republican from Georgia that was in D.C., blamed the crash on the Canova Airport's lack of an electronic glide slope landing system. According to him, if the airport had this system, it would have kept the plane above the ridge. However, FAA, otherwise known as Federal Aviation Administration officials, said the airport equipment was no better and no worse than that of scores of other small airports handling airport traffic daily. Now, the National Transportation Safety Board would publish an official report detailing the findings of their investigation into the crash on April 14th, 1972. According to this report, it could not be determined what the exact cause of the crash was, but they believed it was likely due to the descent below minimum descent altitude during a non-precision approach under adverse operating conditions without visual contact with the runway environment. The 2 most likely scenarios for this descent were either improper use of cockpit instrumentation data or an altimetry system error. The elevation of the trees that were clipped by the aircraft shortly before the crash was approximately 922 feet, and the minimum descent altitude for the aircraft was 1,240 feet. Descent is not authorized until the runway is in sight at any elevation below the minimum descent altitude. 3 recommendations were made by the National Transportation Safety Board as a result of this accident. These recommendations included recommending heads-up displays, ground proximity warning devices, and surveillance and inspection of the flight operations. Now, the crash of Southern Airways Flight 932 is still labeled as the worst air disaster in American sports history to this day. A temporary morgue was actually set up at the National Guard Armory, and a special FBI disaster team was brought in to start the painstaking process of not only recovering the bodies, but having to try and identify them as well. The identifications of the bodies happened throughout the week following the crash, with 36 identified on Monday, 6 on Tuesday, and 23 on Wednesday, with 4 more people that were identified sometime after that. But 6 remains again were too charred for identification to be successful. We are now going to take the time to name the victims of the crash as well as give a little detail about them. We will first start with the 5 crew members aboard Flight 932. Captain Frank Abbott was 47 years old, the pilot of the plane from Atlanta, Georgia, and had been with Southern Airways for 21 years. Danny Deese was the charter coordinator from Charleston Heights, South Carolina, who had been with Southern Airways for 6 years. Charlene Pote was one of 2 flight attendants on board and was from Paducah, Kentucky. And Jerry Smith was from Stone Mountain, Georgia, and he served as the first officer on board and had been with Southern Airways for 5 years. Patricia Vaught was the second flight attendant on board, who was from East Point, Georgia. She had been with Southern Airways for 8 years. 37 members of the football team were on board this flight, and those who were on the offensive team are as follows. I'm going to try and get these pronunciations right, so forgive me if I slip up. Starting with Jim-O Adams, number 51, a senior lineman from Mansfield, Ohio. Mark Andrews was number 61, a junior lineman from Cincinnati, Ohio. Mike Blake, number 67, a sophomore lineman from Huntington. Rick Dardinger, number 50, a senior center from Mount Vernon, Ohio. David DeBoard, number 76, was a senior offensive tackle from Quincy, Florida. Art Harris, number 22, a sophomore fullback from Passaic, New Jersey. Bob Harris, number 21, a backup quarterback from Cincinnati, Ohio, who was a junior at Marshall. Joe Hood, number 33, a sophomore halfback from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Tom Howard, number 60, a junior offensive lineman and punter from Milton, West Virginia. Pat Norrell, number 66, a senior offensive lineman from Hartsdale, New York. Bob Patterson, number 61, an offensive lineman from Lewisburg, North Carolina. Jack Rapassi, number 82, a junior wide receiver from Cincinnati, Ohio. Marcelo Latterman, number 23, sophomore kicker from Lyndhurst, New Jersey. Larry Sanders, number 40, was a junior defensive secondary from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Ted Shoebridge, number 14, the junior starting quarterback from Lyndhurst, New Jersey. Roger Vanover, number 85, a junior tight end from Russell, Kentucky. Freddie Wilson, number 87, a sophomore tight end from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And John Young, number 86, a sophomore tight end from Buchanan, West Virginia. The players on the defensive team consisted of the following: Dennis "The Menace" Blevins, number 80, a junior wide receiver from Bluefield, West Virginia. Willie Bluford, number 31, a junior linebacker from Greenwood, South Carolina. Larry "The Governor" Brown, number 68, a senior defensive lineman from Atlanta, Georgia. Roger Childers, number 27, a defensive standout from St. Albans, West Virginia. Stuart Cottrell, number 43, a sophomore defensive back from Eustis, Florida. Bobby Joe Hill, number 41, a sophomore defensive back and a wide receiver from Dallas, Texas. Rich Lech, number 20, a junior defensive back from Columbus, Ohio, who also played for the Marshall baseball team. Scotty Reese, number 83, a junior defensive end and linebacker from Waco, Texas. Larry Sanders, number 40, a junior defensive secondary from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Al Saylor, number 88, a sophomore defensive end from Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. Art Shannon, number 34, a junior linebacker from Greensboro, North Carolina. Jerry Steinbach, number 56, a junior linebacker from Newport News, Virginia. And Robert Van Horn, number 75, a sophomore tackle from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. The following players are whose remains were too charred for proper identification and were buried together at Spring Hill Cemetery. And I know that hurts to hear. It's the truth, but just so sad. So sorry, y'all. Tom Brown, number 65, was a senior defensive lineman from Richmond, Virginia, who had transferred from Ferrum Junior College in Virginia. Kevin Gilmore, number 24, was a halfback from Harrison, New Jersey. Dave Griffith, number 81, was a senior defensive end from Clarksville, Virginia, who had also transferred from Ferrum Junior College. Barry Nash, number 35, was a sophomore from Henderson, West Virginia. Alan Skeens, number 59, was a sophomore walk-on from Ravenswood, West Virginia. Tom Borrell, number 62, was a junior defensive lineman from Richmond, Virginia, who was another transfer from Ferrum Junior College. 8 members of the Thundering Herd football coaching staff were on board, as well as 2 trainers. So Rick Tolley had only been the head coach for the 1970 season, but was an assistant coach the year before. Deke Brackett was an assistant coach, the kicking coach, and a freshman coordinator who had been the quarterback at the University of Tennessee. Al Corelli Jr. was an offensive line coach from Summerdale, New Jersey, who had just joined the staff in February of 1970. Frank Loria from Clarksburg, West Virginia, had been the defensive back coach since 1969 and was inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame in 1999. Jim Shorty Moss was the offensive coordinator from Huntington, West Virginia, and had been a team captain at WVU and was also drafted by both New York Giants and the Oakland Raiders. Jim Schroer was a native of Cincinnati, Ohio, who served as the head athletic trainer, and Donald Tackett was a student trainer from Dingus, West Virginia, who was a senior at Marshall. Also on board were the team dentist, as well as 3 physicians and their wives. Dr. Joseph Chambers was a Cabell County doctor, as well as a team physician from Beckley, West Virginia, and was joined on the plane by his wife Peggy, who had graduated from the Juilliard School of Music in New York City. Dr. Ray Hagley was another team physician who was the former president of the Marshall Alumni Association. Dr. Hegley's wife, Shirley, was unfortunately on board with him, and Dr. Glenn Preston was born in Lawrence County, Kentucky, and he served as the team dentist. And his wife, Phyllis, was on board as well. And also Dr. Herbert D. Proctor. He was a Navy veteran from Landisburg, West Virginia, who also served as a team physician. His wife, Courtney, was a native of Fayetteville, West Virginia, and had joined her husband on the flight. 6 of the victims were staff from various Marshall departments. Donald Booth volunteered to film the Marshall games and was an alumni of Marshall, as well as a Marine Corps vet who fought in World War II. Norman Weichman from South Point, Ohio, also volunteered to film the game. Charlie Couts was a Huntington native who had been a member of the Marshall staff since 1961 until he became the permanent athletic director in 1969, and he had also fought in World War II and the Korean War as a Marine. Gary George, a junior at Marshall, was from Beckley, West Virginia, and was an assistant in the Sports Information Office, as well as a reporter for the Parthenon, which was the school newspaper. Now, Jeff Nathan was a junior at Marshall University from Parkersburg, West Virginia, also on the flight, and also served as an editor for the Parthenon. Dr. Brian O'Connor was from Staten Island, New York, and had been the director of admissions at Marshall for 18 months prior to the crash, and the remaining 13 victims on board were supporters of the Thundering Herd. Charles "Red" Arnold was an insurance executive from Louisville, Kentucky, who was accompanied by his wife, Rachel Arnold, who was a nurse that served as a second lieutenant in the Army Nurse Corps. Arthur Lawrence Harris was the father of player Art Harris and was born in Montgomery, Alabama. Emmett O. Heath was a U.S. Army veteran as well as a business executive from Oak Hill, West Virginia, although he had lived in Huntington since 1960. His wife, Elaine Heath, was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and was the president of the Midas Muffler Company of Huntington, where her husband also served as secretary and treasurer. Merle Ralston was a Huntington city councilman and was joined on the plane by his wife, Helen. Parker Ward was an automobile dealer from Cincinnati, Ohio. James Jarrell was from Hamlin, West Virginia, and was on board as a supporter and had also served as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army. He was joined by his wife, Cynthia, who was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, and was a member of the Huntington Women's Club. Ken Jones was from Indianapolis, Indiana, and served as sports director at WHTN TV in Huntington. Gene, the voice of the herd, Morehouse, was a native of Newark, New Jersey, who had spent 22 years in broadcasting prior to becoming the sports information director and radio announcer for Marshall in 1968. Michael Prestera was the former Big Green president and the former president of the Boy Scouts of America, as well as a delegate-elect to the West Virginia legislature. A memorial service was held the evening of November 15th at the Veterans Memorial Fieldhouse. Government offices closed for the week, and activities that had been planned for Marshall students were canceled as well. However, classes were only canceled for 2 days, which inspired protests and calls for the boycotting of classes spread throughout the campus. The student government, a fraternity that lost 5 of its members, and a large dormitory urged the school to cancel classes until the end of Thanksgiving break. Students even offered to give up their midwinter break if they were given time off to mourn instead, and Dr. Donald Dedman, who was acting president at the time, responded to the students by simply saying the team would have wanted it that way. Their final football game of the season, which would have been on November 21st against Ohio University, was also canceled despite the surviving members, along with the freshman team being willing to play. Numerous funerals took place over the next few weeks, and while the funeral directors tried their best to schedule funerals so that the times wouldn't conflict, you could still see the funeral processions meeting at intersections throughout Huntington. Rick Nolte, a sports journalist who wrote the book The Marshall Story, stated in an interview that he had attended 13 funerals in a 5-day period after the crash, with 3 of the funerals happening in 1 day. This crash also resulted in 70 kids losing at least one parent, with 18 children being left orphaned. While there were no official survivors from the crash itself, there were those that should have been on that plane but were not, and thank goodness that they were not. Craig Greenlee, who had played 2 seasons for Marshall, wasn't on the plane because he had quit the team shortly before. 2 local journalists were supposed to travel with the herd, but stayed behind at the office to fill in for a coworker that called in sick. Defensive backs Tony Burrell and Felix Gordon didn't go because they were injured. Offensive lineman Ed Carter had traveled to Texas to attend his father's funeral shortly before the crash. Carter's mom had had a dream about the crash and encouraged her son to stay behind a little longer, which ultimately saved his life. Defensive back Richard Taglang had overslept on the Friday that the Thundering Herd had flown out to Greenville, North Carolina. These are just a few examples of those that survived the plane crash by mere chance. Another player that stayed behind due to an injury was co-captain Nate Ruffin, who was deemed the spokesperson for the team after the crash and was tasked with identifying the bodies of his teammates and football staff. Nate Ruffin would be instrumental in developing the 1971 team dubbed the Young Thundering Herd, which would be led by a man named Jack Langell. Langell had previously been a coach at the College of Wooster in Ohio and was hired by the athletic director, Joe McMullen, with whom he had previously worked. However, Langell was not their first choice for the head coach position. Dick Bestwick, who had coached at Georgia Tech, was the first person hired until he backed out after just a week and returned to Georgia. Now, Langell became Marshall's new football coach on March 17, 1971, and with the help of assistant coach Red Dawson, as well as the surviving members of the 1970 team, they set out to rebuild the herd in honor of the 75. And since a majority of the team and the staff had died in the crash, they had no choice but to build the team from scratch. They did this by requesting permission from the NCAA to allow freshmen to play on the team, which had not been previously allowed. The NCAA eventually got rid of this policy altogether in January 1972, and players were also recruited from other Marshall sports teams, such as the baseball and basketball teams. And while the young Thundering Herd lost their first game of the season, they successfully defeated Xavier University in their very first home game since the crash. Marshall beat Xavier that day 15-13 with the last-second touchdown that surprised even the players themselves. They would go on to win one more game that season, but nothing was as meaningful as that first win. The 75 victims of the crash are honored by memorials not only in West Virginia but in Ohio as well. In the middle of Marshall's campus, sitting just outside the Memorial Student Center, there is a memorial fountain created as a visual reminder of the 75 lives lost in that plane crash. And this fountain was created by sculptor Harold Bertoy, and it stands more than 13 feet high and weighs 6,500 pounds. And it was Bertoy's hope that the fountain would commemorate the living rather than death on the waters of life, rising, receding, surging, so as to express upward growth, immortality, and eternality. End quote. President John G. Barker dedicated this fountain to the plane crash victims on November 12, 1972. On the edge of the fountain, there's a bronze plaque that reads, "They shall live on in the hearts of their families and friends forever." And this memorial records their loss to the university and to the community, end quote. Now, sometime in 2008, the fountain received extensive repairs, which included a new granite surface for the foundation, a copper catch tray, and a higher water spray. After the repairs, the memorial fountain was rededicated on April 9th, 2008. Now, every year on November 14th, members of the school and the community of Huntington gather around the fountain to remember and honor the 75 lives lost in the terrible tragedy. Speeches are often given at this ceremony, whether it be from family members of the victims, local government officials, or even Red Dawson himself. As the tradition goes, a wreath is laid on the fountain and then it is shut off until the following spring. The memorial dedicated to the victims at Spring Hill Cemetery is visited by the football team every year before the season starts as well. This memorial is a granite cenotaph that marks the spot where the 6 unidentified remains were buried together. Now, surviving member of the 1970 team, Nate Ruffin, who passed away in 2001, is buried near his teammates as well. There are also 2 statues on campus in memory of the 75, with one located in front of the rec center and the other directly in front of Jones C. Edwards Stadium, which is where the Thundering Herd plays every home game. Been there many times, and it's a fond memory of my childhood. Again, go Herd. Shortly after the crash, the East Carolina University student government announced that a memorial fund will be created in remembrance of the victims of the crash. The plan was to use the money not only for a memorial on campus, but also so they could send a copy of the game film to the parents of the Marshall football players that died. ECU head coach Mike McGee told a newspaper, quote, "In the years to come, this film will become a treasured memento because these young men lived and died for football," end quote. In 2006, a memorial plaque was placed outside the visitors' side of Dowdy-Ficklin Stadium at ECU. This plaque includes an image of the memorial fountain and is inscribed with the following words, quote, "This memorial is dedicated to the memory of the 1970 Marshall University football team that valiantly played its final game on this very gridiron. The tragedy will be remembered and honored through this memorial for a team that gave its all. Their flight to eternity forever changed the lives of those who dearly loved them. We honor their dedication, discipline, and devotion to the game of football as no other team in history has given so much. They shall live on in the hearts of their families and friends forever. And this memorial records the loss to their university and the entire intercollegiate athletic community," end quote. The Ohio University and Xavier University football teams canceled their annual appreciation banquets and chose instead to donate the funds to the Marshall Athletic Program. Marshall's successful comeback after the crash would go on to inspire the creation of the movie We Are Marshall, starring big-name celebrities such as Matthew McConaughey, Matthew Cox, and Anthony Mackie. One of Anthony Mackie's early movies, actually. Now, filming of the movie began on April 3rd, 2006, and the majority of it was filmed at Marshall University, with some scenes being filmed in Atlanta, Georgia. This movie was created by Warner Brothers and Thunder Road Pictures and was directed by McG. I guess that's how you say it. It's MCG. This has not been the first time since the crash that Marshall University had been approached about making a film detailing the tragedy. Every proposal had been declined until the summer of 2005, when Warner Brothers reached out and provided a quality script that Marshall could get behind. While the 2006 movie We Are Marshall was fairly accurate, the production team did take a lot of creative liberties when making it. The movie starts out with a mistake by saying, quote, "In the middle of Huntington, West Virginia, there is a river," when the Ohio River doesn't actually run through West Virginia. The Ohio River actually forms the city's northern border with Ohio. Another example of the use of creative liberties is the frequent use of the We Are Marshall chant throughout the film, when in reality this chant was not introduced until sometime in the 1980s, which was at least a decade after the time period the movie was set in. The chant originated in the university's old Fairfield Stadium, where the scoreboard would light up with alternating arrows to indicate which side of the crowd should lead the cheer. This chant can still be heard at every Marshall game now. And another inaccuracy is the scene where Nate Ruffin storms into a board meeting and points outside to a crowd of students chanting, "We Are Marshall," and causing the board to change their minds about eliminating the football team. Not only did the We Are Marshall chant not happen, as we just mentioned, but the football program was never actually in jeopardy of being eliminated to begin with. The remaining football players, along with others, worked hard from the start to ensure the football program survived after the crash. The movie also depicts Red Dawson as giving up his seat on the plane so someone else could make it back in time for his granddaughter's recital, when Dawson was never supposed to be on the plane at all in real life. The movie depicts Dawson as leaving from North Carolina and heading to Virginia on a recruiting trip, when it was actually the opposite. Red Dawson and another staff member named Deke Breckett did not fly to the game because they had been sent on a recruiting trip to Virginia a few days before, and instead drove from Virginia to Greenville, North Carolina on the day of the game. Now, Dawson and Breckett were supposed to drive back to Huntington from the game together, but instead Breckett ended up taking the seat of grad assistant Gail Parker, who drove home with Red Dawson instead. Now, while a majority of the characters in the movie were real people, two of them were actually made up. Those characters were Paul Griffin, who portrayed as a father of one of the football players that died, and Annie Cantrell, who was portrayed as a cheerleader and fiance of Griffin's son. Not only were these characters made up, but the cheerleaders did not actually attend the East Carolina game like it was portrayed in the movie, nor did the marching band. Similar to how it is today for a lot of schools, there was not enough room for all of the cheerleaders to be flown out, and they had a policy that either they all go or none of them go. Now, the marching band doesn't even go to away games now due to lack of funding, so it's likely it was the same back then. In fact, in 2018, members of the Marching Thunder pep band for the basketball team were flown out to Texas for the basketball championships, but were forced to ride a Greyhound bus all the way back to Huntington, West Virginia, due to the athletic department only buying return flights for the basketball team. The journey back took a little over 2 days due to the requirements on how many hours a driver can be on the road before they can have a break. And this comes straight from our researcher for this episode, who was one of those members on that bus. So thank you, Miranda, for adding that personal note. One thing the movie did get partially right is that WVU's football team had a green cross on the back of their helmets during the 1971 season to honor the 75 people killed in the crash. However, while the movie paints WVU and Marshall as rivals, and it is true now, they actually didn't compete against each other until 1997, nor did they fight over recruiting players. Both schools were Division I programs, but the best football players in the state always went to WVU if they stayed in West Virginia at all. Now, Miranda was a Marshall graduate. She wrote that. Please don't hold that against me. That's just how it went. Again, go her. Despite these inaccuracies, We Are Marshall was still able to successfully convey the tragedy that consumed the school as well as the surrounding community, as well as how the team refused to let the 75 die in vain. Now, in the 55 years since the tragic plane crash, the Thundering Herd has continued to give its all, really. Just like the 1970 team. So far, they have competed in a total of 19 bowl games with a record of 13 wins and 6 losses. They've also won 2 national championships, one in 1992 and the other in 1996. Since the creation of their home field, the Jones C. Edwards Stadium in 1991, the Herd holds a record of 192 wins and 45 losses at the Jones. The Thundering Herd also has the honor of 6 of its players and 1 of its coaches having been inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame, with 5 of those inductions happening after the 1970 crash. Fans continue to lose their voices screaming, "We are Marshall, baby!" at every game. No matter how many years pass, the 75 will never be forgotten. We here at Creepalachia dedicate this episode to the memory of the 75 lives lost on November 14th, 1970. Now, 55 years later, their memory will live on in the hearts of Marshall fans and Marshall alumni everywhere and all West Virginians. And as always, go Herd. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to this episode. Got chills reading throughout this whole thing. It's just so devastating to think about and to really grasp how many lives were lost and the ripple effect that this caused for West Virginia. But Marshall has a really special place in my heart, and I'll lighten up on the jabs, I promise. But it's all meant in fun and sport. But this is nothing's funny or happy about this. I guess the bittersweet part is West Virginians persevere, and that's what we do. And watching Randy Moss and Chad Pennington when I was a kid, it was great memories for me. Seeing them, and we almost lost. You almost got us our first game, and I believe it was 97. I can remember it like it was yesterday, but nobody in this state, there'll never be a receiver as good as Randy Moss in this state. I just don't think there will be. But anyways, thank you all for taking the time. Rest in peace to those fallen, and I hope you all have a good evening. And be sure to follow and subscribe to Creepalachia for more eerie content from the hills. And above all else, always remember, go herd.